Good evening, I'm Duncan Golostani. Arrivals from high-risk countries landed in London this morning but will not be on their way home until the middle of next week. Instead, they are checked in and settling into life in quarantine hotels, the latest tool in the government's arsenal to keep coronavirus cases down. On that, some good news. London's case rate has fallen below the national average, now at 151 per 100,000 compared to 159 across the UK. We'll have more in a moment on what that means for the easing of restrictions here. But first, our political correspondent Simon Harris reports from Heathrow Airport.
At the end of a long flight and the inevitable queue at passport control, there was a new experience for some weary travellers arriving at Heathrow. These were the first passengers to face a security guard escort from the terminal to a waiting bus before the short ride to a quarantine hotel. At the nearby Holiday Inn, two women travelling from the United Arab Emirates had a coach all to themselves, along with their 9 cases. Akshara told me she was a student here to do a master's in big data science. The new arrivals must spend the next 10 days largely confined to their rooms. They can't mix with other guests, but they will be allowed out for exercise. To make sure no one breaks the rules, security guards patrolled the hotel grounds.
This is our place for 10 days. Look.
Wagner and Elaine, a husband and wife from Finchley in North London, found themselves caught by the new quarantine rules after their planned flight home from Brazil was cancelled. They're now separated from their 4 children. Their youngest is 6.
Our 6-year-old is crying a lot. She's missing us a lot, and she's suffering.
We cannot walk in the corridor. We can't do nothing. It's like a prison with a nice bed and a TV.
Anyone travelling from one of 33 so-called red list countries has to pay £1,700 for this experience in self-isolation. That includes 3 meals a day delivered to the door of your room as a takeaway, although the Renaissance has added the homely touch of china and cutlery. Union leaders representing hotel staff and security guards are worried about the disease spreading, but hotel managers say they're taking precautions.
Once the operation starts, this becomes an island site, and only residents and those working will be allowed into the hotel grounds. All staff will be tested every single day, and they'll also be doing a PCR test every 2 or 3 days as well.
Heathrow bosses have asked the government to make sure there are enough border force officials to keep the flow of passengers moving. But ministers suggested some hold-ups were unavoidable.
Inevitably, because border force are asking more difficult questions, inevitably that does have an impact, but that's only the right thing to do when you're trying to protect the country in a pandemic.
Tonight, Labour called the hotel quarantine scheme flawed and half-baked. But for the foreseeable future, this is the welcome some air passengers arriving in London can expect.
Simon, Boris Johnson is expected to reveal his roadmap for lifting restrictions in a week's time. Any clues on what's going to be in that?
Well, lots of speculation in the last 24 hours about how far and how fast the government might go in lifting those restrictions. But the Prime Minister was more cautious today. He said all that should be taken with a pinch of salt. He did say he was increasingly optimistic about the possibilities as infection rates came down. But on a visit to Orpington in South East London, he had this message.
Rates of infection, although they're coming down, are still comparatively high. So we've got to be very prudent. And what we want to see is progress that is cautious but irreversible. I think that's what the public and people up and down the country would want to see.
We know, as you say, the number of infections, new cases in London is down below the national average, 151 for every 100,000. And ministers will begin crunching those numbers this week to prepare for the lockdown. But in the last hour, the Prime Minister has said that he doesn't have sufficient data yet to call it.
OK, Simon, thank you.
Good evening. The streets of London are much quieter than usual, but that hasn't stopped violence spilling onto them. More people have been murdered in the capital so far this year than at the same point last year, before the pandemic. Last night, a 13th man was killed. The Mayor's concern is that with the easing of restrictions could come an increase in violence for Sadiq Khan and his main rival at this year's mayoral elections, Sean Bailey. Stopping that happening is top of their list of priorities. Our political correspondent, Simon Harris, reports.
Lockdown is having little effect on London's murder rate. On a balcony outside flats in Kentish Town, a man in his 30s was stabbed to death. Today, Denyer House was at the centre of a police cordon. Plastic sheets protected the scene of the killing from rain as forensic science officers combed the balcony for clues and evidence. People living on the estate have described to us the frantic efforts, first by friends and then by paramedics, to try to save the victim. The words, "Stay with us," could clearly be heard several times. More Londoners have been murdered in 2021 than in the first 6 weeks of the previous 2 years. In 2019 and 2020, there were 11 murders at this point in the calendar. This year, 13 people have been murdered, despite lockdown. These are just some of the faces of Londoners who've died violently since the 1st of January. Campaigners aren't surprised at the lockdown spike in violence.
I think the pandemic has really impacted on people's mental health, and staying home, especially young people, staying home now doesn't seem to be an option. Parents are struggling to keep their young people in.
Anger still exists. People having arguments, falling out. People are under a lot more stress, mental health, financial situations. So sometimes, in a way, being locked down has probably heightened a lot of these things.
London's crime rate is likely to be prominent in the mayoral election. Campaigning doesn't officially kick off until next month, but in Bethnal Green, Sadiq Khan joined officers on patrol to announce he would use council taxpayers' money to safeguard 1,300 police jobs. And he's worried about what happens when lockdown ends.
The predictions we have from other parts of the world based on their evidence where they've eased lockdown is an increase in crime. We saw that in some American cities. We've seen that in some European cities. We're planning now to try and ameliorate the chance of that happening in London.
The mayor has fundamentally misunderstood why crime is growing in London. The key thing is, if you're a criminal and you're not being pursued, you're not being challenged, you will keep growing, and other criminals will see that and join in, and we're building up a real head of steam.
Scotland Yard said 2 men were in custody following yesterday's murder in Camden. Simon Harris, ITV News, Kentish Town.
Now, more areas of Woking are set to face surge testing for the South African mutation of COVID-19. Mass testing was carried out in the Surrey borough earlier this month, and one new case of the variant has been discovered. That means it's now the turn of those in the GU22 postcode to take a coronavirus test, regardless of whether they have symptoms or not, as our political correspondent Simon Harris reports.
For the second time this month, surge testing is coming to Woking. Not GU21 this time, but the neighbouring postcode of GU22. Homes in and around the Maybury estate are being targeted to try to suppress the South African variant of COVID-19. The NHS has identified a single case of the South African variant in this area, but that's enough to trigger the mass testing of around 2,500 households over the next few days. Surge testing, as seen in Woking 2 weeks ago, involves door-to-door visits by council workers delivering and collecting test kits. Surrey County Council says it believes the 2 outbreaks in the same town are a coincidence and not linked. Testing should reveal whether any other cases exist.
Scary, isn't it? It is really scary. But obviously just take the test and hope for the best, really, don't you?
I'm okay with that, and it's good to do that. At least we can trace how worse the case here in our area.
I'm a teaching assistant, so I've been used to doing lateral flow tests. So, I mean, I think it's good. I just think it's a lot of work, isn't it?
Surge testing relies on the PCR method, where swabs are sent to a lab. The much faster lateral flow test, which delivers a result in minutes, could soon become a way of life. The government is believed to be on the verge of sending out hundreds of thousands of test kits to homes and workplaces every day.
We need to use all the tools at our disposal to get out of this safely, and mass testing absolutely is part of that, to ensure that as the vaccine programme rolls out, we still follow where the virus is, we find cases so that people can isolate.
Lateral flow tests might also throw a lifeline to the West End. Earlier this week, the Prime Minister suggested they could be used to test people going into theatres, cinemas and nightclubs.
We need to find out a lot more about these tests, but the really important thing about them is that they need to be easy to administer and very quick results. So we cut the time down to turn the whole thing round.
Woking's hibernating leisure centre will be the logistics hub for the town's latest mass population test. It's expected to take a few days to test everyone, but it could be a few weeks before the results are revealed. Simon Harris, ITV News, Woking.
Well, some less encouraging numbers today after it emerged just 10% of those eligible for a coronavirus vaccine in Tower Hamlets have had the jab, and take-up has been weakest among black residents. ITV News has learned that just over half of black people in the East London borough have had their first dose, and that figure is 30% lower than among white residents. Tonight, ITV and other commercial channels will broadcast a video reassuring people the vaccine is safe. Our political correspondent Simon Harris reports.
Agnes didn't want the jab. A bad reaction to a flu vaccine put her off. But the 80-year-old mother of 5 was persuaded by her children to talk to her GP. And today she arrived at the vaccination centre in Mile End.
Wonderful. It's wonderful. There's no need to be frightened.
You were apprehensive to begin with?
Yes, I was. And I have been because I was thinking, oh, well, this is not necessary. But it is necessary.
Among the over 70s in Tower Hamlets, it's estimated 85% of the white community has had a vaccine. But in the South Asian community, that falls to 69%. And among over 70s in Tower Hamlets' black community, it's just 59%.
GPs are phoning around their patients on a regular basis. Some of them are quite weary of phoning around because some patients have been phoned several times now. People are being visited in their homes, in day centres and so on. And so we need to get these numbers up.
The worry now is that some younger people in Tower Hamlets might be even more reluctant to be vaccinated than their parents and grandparents.
They're more social media savvy. They'll be having access to some of the misinformation that's there in some of the WhatsApp groups. There's also many younger generations are really politicised, and so they then have certain mistrust of societal structures.
In the Mile End Vaccine Centre, today was a Pfizer day.
So I do that 10 times. You just have to slowly agitate it 10 times.
That means the process is a bit slower. Jackie, who's a local GP, was hoping to vaccinate at least 24 patients during her 4-hour shift.
The trials have all shown that they're effective, and it's important to have hope in something like this, but we mustn't just throw everything away now and abandon all the safety measures and go back to business as usual, because if we do, we risk a third wave.
The message wasn't lost on Susan, as she had her jab.
We all still need to be really careful. I know the community that I live in, we're all being really careful about social distancing still, even the older ones who've had theirs already. So, yeah. But yes, it bodes well, hopefully, for the future.
After his injection, Kevin was heading home to do some decorating. He shares the hopes of many.
I want to get back to the pub. I'll miss it, and a restaurant.
The centre aims to inoculate 400 people a day. On Saturday, it's putting on a special clinic for the local Somali community. Simon Harris, ITV News, Mile End.